Hello and welcome at Book Lovers Companion. My name is Edith, and as you can see, dear listeners, I'm all on my own. The teacup is making tea, and she left me to my own devices. Our CEO is also quite busy outdoors roaming the estate. Before we welcome our guests on the show, greetings go to the West Midlands, to Stourbridge Junction Station, to Certain Croc, Nippy, to a lovely ginger boy, George, the FC, and all the lovely staff at Stourbridge Junction Station. Hello and thank you for spreading the word, dear Nippy. Now let's welcome our guest, Elze. Hello
Hi.
and welcome at
Hello.
Book Lovers Companion.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you on our show, and it's all about editing in our episode 108. And like I said before we went online with this episode, it's all about the stages, what is going to happen when we do editing. You've joined us from the Netherlands.
Yes.
Yes. And my question is again, I have a manuscript on my computer. Now, what do I do?
What now?
Yeah, exactly. What now?
um, yeah, I can just start by covering the whole process from start to
Yeah.
finish as I see it, because I
Mhm,
do want to emphasize that this is the way that I see it, and it's based on my experience with
mhm,
lots of writers around the world throughout the years, also based on working with publishers and all those kinds of things, but still it's quite a subjective
okay.
field.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, but in general, I would say that you start out with an idea, you create a manuscript, and then you enter the editing stage, which I divide into two sections: self editing and professional editing. And the professional editing part can look differently depending on how you choose to publish. So, if you want to traditionally publish through a publisher, you probably won't hire an editor before you submit your manuscript, and you'll end up working with a professional editor in house, either at an agency or at a publisher or both. And if you want to self publish, it is highly recommended that you hire an editor before you hit that publish button. But there's a part in between the manuscript finishing the first draft, or the initial draft, as I like to call it, and the professional editing, which is self editing, and that is, in my experience, highly underused. It's the part where you improve your writing as much as you can before sending it to someone else. And the reason that's so important is that the more you do before you pay someone to look at your work, or you get
Mhm.
at a publisher and the in-house editor looks at your work, the stronger your voice is going to be, and the more value you're going to get from their time and for your money if you hire someone yourself.
Mhm.
Because if you
Yeah.
don't do that and you hire someone, they're gonna spend hours doing things that if you had the right tools, you could have done yourself. And it's such a shame when that happens, because it's expensive to hire an editor. And you want to make sure that they help you get to a point you wouldn't be able to reach on your own.
Mhm. Yeah,
Um,
of course. Yeah.
yeah, so that's the way I would
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
describe the entire process from start to finish. And then the self-editing part is the part that I focus on. I also have
Mhm.
experience as a professional editor, so we can definitely talk about that whole spectrum.
Mhm. Mhm.
And preparing for the editing process also starts as you draft. Um, yeah, go
Yeah.
ahead.
My question would be the first when you get this manuscript, okay, and
hmm
the author worked on it a lot already, but still, what is really the first thing you look for in a new manuscript?
That's an interesting question. I think it would depend on the author's goal. Like,
Mhm.
why are they showing it to me? Do they want to me to put the finishing touches on it? Do they want me to help them develop it?
Mhm.
I have to say that even if they ask me to help them put the finishing touches on a manuscript, I will look beyond that and probably recommend that they take some other big picture issues into account as well. Um, but what I typically look for is potential.
Mhm.
Um, with the big picture, that comes down to which characters are strong, which
Mhm.
storylines are strong
Mhm.
and can be expanded on,
Mhm.
and which of the characters could be really interesting and
Mhm.
strong but are not
Mhm.
at present, and how can
Mhm.
you make them stronger.
Mhm.
And when it comes to the more detailed things like writing style and writing voice, using the right words, making sure that descriptions resonate with your reader,
Mhm.
um, then I look for the sentences that already work and what works in those, because you want more of that in the parts that don't flow as well yet.
Mhm. Mhm. So basically, it means you look uh, for or look at the plot. What is the story about? What about the characters? How, let's say, how fleshed out they are,
Hmm.
and what needs a little bit more tweaking here and there. And only the last step would be the style.
Yes,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Mhm.
That's something that I was taught during my master's in editing.
Mhm.
That at first we were all like, no, but that's impossible. And I see this happening again and again with writers that I work with. It's you're going to save yourself a ton of time and frustration if you focus on the big picture first and then move down to the details. Because
Mhm.
if you start out by polishing your writing and spend hours and hours perfecting the words and everything, and then you look at the big picture, you look at the story, or you look at the characters, and something's not right, and you
Mhm.
end up having to delete chapters or move stuff around, it's going to feel really horrible to have to delete those things that you've already worked hours and hours on. And
Mhm.
if you focus on the story and the characters and all the big picture stuff first and make sure that that's all as good as it can be, and then you move down to the details, you know that all the time that you're going to spend on those details is worth it.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I see. So the story has to be there. There has to be, like you said before, there has to be potential in the story itself.
Yeah, and you need to make sure that there are no major, like if there's a major plot point and
Mhm.
you start polishing the entire story to make it look pretty and sound pretty,
Mhm.
you may still need to make major adjustments
Mhm.
down the line, which is a shame for all the time that you've put into picking all the
Mhm.
right words to get
Mhm.
across emotions for characters who
Mhm.
may maybe have to go
Mhm. Mhm.
eventually. And you asked about plot and characters, and for me, those are intertwined.
Mhm.
I know that like everybody has a different process when it comes to that, but for me, the characters are the core of any story, even if it's technically not a character-driven story,
Okay.
because for me, the plot is a consequence of what the characters do and who the characters
Mhm.
are. If you come across a plot point in a book or a series or a movie, more often than not, it's going to be it doesn't make sense for that character to make this decision. And you can avoid that by getting to know your characters on a really deep level,
Mhm.
so that when you go through the story and you ask yourself, would this character behave in this way? You know if the answer is yes or no.
Mm.
And what you can then do is either adjust the story to make it make sense with what would make sense for that character, or you keep what's happening and you change things on the character side for it to make sense for them to react that way. For
Mhm.
example, if you have a character who is um, always eagerly jumps into relationships and doesn't think about it. And then suddenly you have this book, a story, and she's like, "Oh, I'm gonna be fully committed to this one guy." Um, and no, wait, that's not a good answer. Let me rewind a little bit.
Mhm. Mhm.
If you have a character who jumps from relationship to relationship, and then suddenly she's like, "Okay, I'm gonna be committed for like the long haul."
Mhm.
Um, that has to make sense in some way. Like either she has had an experience that made her think, okay, I need to approach relationships differently, or
Yeah,
um, she just followed this course about mindfulness, or I don't know, like whatever works for that particular character. But
yeah,
as a reader, you need to be able to follow their train of thought,
yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah. I
even
have,
if,
yeah,
yeah, even if it would be interesting to read about that character in that situation that they would not normally be in. It needs to make
mhm,
sense for them to end up in that place, if that
yeah,
makes sense.
yeah, 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 yeah. It absolutely makes sense. I mean, from also from the reader's point of view, of course, because
Hmm.
then you think, what? Why now?
Exactly. Yeah.
All of a sudden doesn't, like you said, doesn't make sense at all
Yeah.
when something happens and it's completely, we would say, out of character.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and you
Yeah.
need a reason why someone acts out of character, so to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And for me, a simple way to fix plot holes that you come across as you self edit is to ask your character what makes you behave this way. Like
mm-hmm,
why do you make this decision?
yeah,
And if you don't get that answer, then the question becomes, what would it take for you to make this decision?
yeah, yeah, true. And that also brings me to the question you said. Again, we said plot, characters, writing style. And
Hmm.
there's always the question with authors about planning or go with the flow.
Yeah.
So, following what you just said, for me, it would mean you need to do at least some planning.
Yes and no. There's nothing wrong with winging it in the first draft. You can just discovery writing is a wonderful thing that I absolutely love as well. It's a wonderful feeling to start writing and just see where your characters take you.
Hmm.
And that's why it's very, very common for a first draft to make no sense at all in the big picture. A lot of writers feel like they've done something wrong when they end up with a story that doesn't make sense
Hmm.
as they've written. But for me, it's like it's only natural. If you're going to write that way without planning ahead, it's not going to make sense, and that's okay. Then the first step when it comes to self-editing is to
Yeah.
look at your story as it is and take stock of what the storyline is and if it
Hmm.
makes sense.
Hmm.
And that way you can what's the word um, outline after the fact.
Hmm.
So you can reconstruct the story based on what you've written,
Hmm.
even if you didn't plan ahead. So you can either plan ahead and then you'll have less planning to do after the first draft, or you can just wing it and do all the planning once the first draft is done.
Hmm. But here we are with plot. What about characters? You said characters are essential, even if it's not a character driven
Mhm.
book or story.
Yeah.
So, for characters, I mean, sometimes you do have a picture of your character in your head. You put that down.
Mhm.
But then
Yeah.
when you write and during the writing, another character makes an appearance. Does that happen often? I suppose it does. I mean,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah.
In my experience and from what I hear from other writers around me, it's more often than not that
Mm,
happens.
mm. And the question is also how incorporate them. I mean, I have a full flushed out character. I
Hmm.
know how this person acts and why this person acts like, and then this character suddenly shows up. And do you think, or have you experienced that people have trouble putting them into the story, or is it easy?
I feel like often when a character appears that wasn't planned beforehand, it's because they're a necessary part of the story.
Mm-hmm.
That said, I'm experiencing this with my own work in progress right now,
Okay.
where I have the main character and his father is a big part of the story. And as I started looking at the first draft, I realized that his mother also needs to play a big role, but I don't know a lot about her.
Mm-hmm.
So the next step then becomes to dive into who she is and
Mm-hmm.
what role she plays into the story in the story. And
Mm-hmm.
that is also one of the things that I recommend in my self-editing academy to before you dive into actual edits to spend the quality time with your characters to all of your characters, not just the main character, to get to know them to the point where you know how they'd
Mm-hmm.
act in every situation,
Mm-hmm.
so that it ties together more easily and the
Mm-hmm.
relationships between the characters make more sense and
Mm-hmm.
come across more naturally.
Mm-hmm. Do you think or have you experienced that different genres go about writing but also editing in a different way?
That's an interesting question. I think the basics are the same, um, but there's definitely a different emphasis in different genres. And I always recommend writers to look for a professional editor who has experience with their genre.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I read the odd thriller every now and again, but I'm not the right person to edit your thriller because I am not familiar enough with the genre to
Mm-hmm.
know about recurring tropes, to know about typical characters that you'd encounter, to know about what readers are looking for in a thriller.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very vital information to have as an editor,
Mm-hmm.
um, because it helps you help the writer
Mm-hmm.
get to a point where their writing fits the genre that they're looking to fit into.
Mm-hmm.
That said, you can also just write the story for the story and not want to fit into any particular genre.
Mm-hmm.
Genres are in itself insanely fluid and changing throughout the years, so that's a whole nother topic. But
That's another
yeah,
live stream.
yeah, exactly. I'd be happy to do it,
Yeah,
but
you're welcome, of course, always. You said when you started explaining about editing that
Mhm,
that you want to point to the question of traditional publishing versus self-publishing.
mhm,
So my question would be, in the traditional publishing world, when you get the
mhm.
in-house editor, how much influence does the author have after his or her manuscript went off to the editor compared to uh, the hired editor for self-publishing
Yeah.
authors?
That is a very, very good question that not a lot of people ask, but they probably should. I can only base this on my experience at a children's publishing house in the Netherlands almost 10 years ago. But from what I've seen, there is less influence that you have as an author when you work with an in-house publisher
Mm,
versus when you work with a hired publisher, just because when you self-publish, you're the one who makes the final call, and
mhm,
when you work with an in-house editor, they are the one who makes the final call. And of course, there's going to be conversations with the editor, and they're not just going to make blind changes to your manuscript. They're going to discuss it with you, and they're going to give you feedback so that you can rewrite and all those things. But in the end, the final editing rounds are done in house, and you get to approve the draft, but you're not the one who makes the final changes.
mm, mm. And what about established authors or authors who sell a lot of books? Is there a difference between the newbies and
Hmm.
the, you know?
I don't. I don't think there's that much of a difference. I do
Mm,
feel like authors who are established and have published a lot more titles are more in sync with what the editor is looking for and what their readers are looking for.
mhm.
And I do feel like there may be a little bit more freedom just because the publisher knows that the book is going to sell.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. Like publishers, it's commercial, and
Mm.
there's nothing you can change about that. They need to make money.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
Yeah,
Understandable. Because that's what they are here for. Exactly.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And now we have, uh, okay, my manuscript store no plot holes anymore. Everything makes sense. Okay. My
Mhm.
characters are easy to recognize, or they are people who feel real. So,
Yes.
next step, like you said, what about the writing style now? How much work can be done to improve on your style,
A lot.
or how much
And
should be
it's,
done
yeah,
to improve your
you
style
can
so
do,
that it is still recognizable as something that you have written?
yeah. Oh, I like the way you put that. It's because in my experience, the more you edit, the closer it gets to your actual voice. Um, and there are a lot of steps that I put into line edits,
Mm-hmm.
which is what the detailed edits are called.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When you go line by
Mm-hmm.
line,
Mm-hmm.
um, sometimes also referred to as copy edits, slight
Mm-hmm.
differences. But um, in my academy, I separate different stages also into digital edits and edits on paper.
Mm-hmm.
And the digital edits, like Pro Writing Aid, is your best friend at this stage. It's editing software that has a free version with all features that you get with the premium version as well. The only limit is that you can only input 500 words at a time.
Mm-hmm.
So, but at the same time, even if you have the premium version, I would not recommend inputting your entire manuscript at once because it takes a lot of time to generate
Yeah. Yeah.
suggestions. So it's a great free tool to use that has a ton of features,
Mm-hmm.
very much geared to fiction writers as well. It's
Mm-hmm.
very similar to Grammarly in the way that it highlights grammar issues and ways to improve writing style and stuff. But it's so much more in terms of also highlighting dialogue, passive voice. Um, it's everything from basic things like sentence length and spelling and grammar issues, overused words,
Mm-hmm.
repetitions, but also things like what percentage of sight related words do you use? What percentage of hearing related words do you
Mm-hmm.
use? Like all the different senses.
Mm-hmm.
So you can actively try to cater your audience by highlighting different types of senses. We all
Mm-hmm.
have a preference for one or two senses, which makes sense, but every reader is going to have a different preference. So it's going to be helpful to get them into the scene to highlight the different types of senses
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
that exist.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and one of my mantras is focus on a single thing at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And Pro Writing Aid helps with that when you go through the different features one by one. And as you go through each feature, you see your manuscript coming together more and more as you remove words and replace words with stronger alternatives. They have a very powerful rephrase tool nowadays where if you see a sentence and you know that it can be improved but you're not sure how, you can use the rephrase tool and maybe it will inspire you to like I'm not saying that you should blindly accept whatever it suggests, but it might inspire you to use
Mm-hmm.
words that you might not have thought of before to construct a sentence in your own
Mm-hmm.
voice.
Mm-hmm.
um, and I feel like the process of getting to your own writing voice also has to do with um, eliminating the words that aren't necessary while enhancing the words that are.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and part of that you can do on your own,
Mm-hmm.
and part of that you'll need others for. And others in the sense of a professional editor, but also in the sense of beta readers and or
Mm-hmm.
critique partners
Mm-hmm.
who can highlight what they love about your writing voice.
Okay.
And if there are passages where they're like zoning out a little bit, you know that those need more attention.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Um, I also have a question regarding the things you just mentioned before. You explained everything. You said
Mhm.
line editing, line by line editing. Okay, and you just mentioned copy editing. Can you just explain for our listeners what the difference is between those two?
I feel like there are a lot of different definitions going around. um, and I know that some people will have very clear definitions
Mm-hmm.
of each of those things, but
Mm-hmm.
the terms that I personally use are developmental edits for the big picture, so story structure,
Mhm.
character consistency, world building, and timing and pace.
Mhm.
And I mentioned plot, right? Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, and then line edits for the detailed edits because it's line by line. And
Mhm.
then the final round is proofreading,
Mhm.
which I feel like some people may not be aware that that is the final round. Like the reason it's called proofreading is that back in the day when everything was done on paper,
Mhm.
the proof was called it was the story when it was printed
Mhm.
just before it was
Mhm. Mhm.
officially published.
Mhm.
So we had this printed version, and everything was typeset and everything. And it was just a final read through to make sure that there were no major errors. And if there were any errors, they needed to be fixed, but it was very expensive to do so
Mm.
because they needed to adjust the
Yeah.
typesetting.
Yeah.
And even nowadays, at a publisher, the proofreading stage is done in the final PDF that's ready to go to the printer.
Mhm.
So making changes in that requires a formatter, which is who
Mhm.
you pay by the hour or by the page
Mm.
or whatever. So it is way more expensive than making a change in Word file,
Mm.
um,
Mm.
which is why the proofreading is just about like actual mistakes. If there are any style things that could be just a little bit prettier, you're not going to make those changes in the proofreading stage.
Ah, okay. Okay. And what about perspective when we talk about editing? I mean, we had plot, we had characters, we had writing style. How
Mhm.
can someone, just asking for a friend, how can someone improve on perspective? For example, because people
It's
always say,
a,
"Oh, change of perspective," and I mean, as an author, you perfectly know whose
right.
perspective it is and in whose head you are. But again,
Yeah.
for the reader,
Yeah.
again, just
That's
asking
a
for a
good
friend.
question. Just for a friend. Um, Something that I like to use as a way to make sure that you're staying in the same head is that when you write out thoughts, make sure that they're using words that the character would use. So if you have a character like Gaston from Beauty and the Beast,
Mm-hmm.
he might say about himself his strong arms because he admires himself and his strength. But if he were just a regular Joe from down the street, he would probably not describe his arms as strong, even though he might be muscular. Um, so, especially when you're writing in third person, it can be a very helpful tool to make sure that you're not pulling the reader away from the way that character thinks.
Mm-hmm.
Um, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. So the thoughts have to again be consistent with the person, with
Yeah,
the character. Yeah, absolutely.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I
And
mean, especially like you said in third person.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, because when you're writing in first person, you can't share any information that that person would not have,
Yeah.
because then you're getting outside of their
Yeah.
perspective,
Yeah.
and um, you have several different points of view in third person. You have third person limited,
Mm-hmm.
which is similar to first person except in third person. You're
Mm-hmm.
following one character at a time, and
Mm-hmm.
the reader only knows what they know.
Mm-hmm.
An example of this is Harry Potter.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he doesn't know what Hermione or Ron are thinking or whatever is happening on the other side of the world at that point.
Yeah.
Um, you also have third person omniscient, which where the reader knows everything that's going on, everything past, present,
Mm-hmm.
and future. And that includes an external narrator who sometimes is one of the characters, sometimes is just an inexistent character, like in I think Charles Dickens does that, where he there is a narrator who tells the story, but he's not part of the characters.
Mm-hmm.
You also have another example of, I don't know if you're familiar with a series of unfortunate events.
Don't
It's
think
a
so.
children's book series by Lemony Snicket, which is a pen name, and Lemony Snicket is also
Okay.
a character in the book, but
Yeah,
also
yeah,
the
yeah,
narrator of
yeah,
the
yeah.
entire story. And the fun things that you can do with that is, because you know what's going to happen, you can also let the reader know, like this and that character didn't know that in three
Mm-hmm.
years did this or that happen.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be a very fun way to add your own voice as the writer, but it's also very easy to overdo it.
Okay. Yeah. Also, the unreliable narrator, like you said. I mean, there's also
Unreliable narrator is often third person limited
yeah,
because you'll be inside their head
yeah,
or first
yeah,
person.
yeah. Exactly. What about dialogue in
Hmm.
a novel, in a book? People sometimes find it hard to write dialogue, others find it easy. I often hear from authors that have experience in script writing, for example,
Hmm.
that they find it quite easy to write dialogue. Others struggle a little bit. Do you have any
Yeah,
hints for people?
it's interesting that you're saying script writers often find it easier. That makes a lot of sense, because I think script writers aren't worried about using dialogue tags and things like that. They use the words that the character says and they use actions
Mm-hmm.
to show what's happening. And that's exactly what I would recommend in in writing dialogue. Don't focus on using extra words. Focus on what the character says and focus on what they do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you stick to those, you'll often end up with a very succinct um, passage of dialogue that showcases what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And another tip that I can give, that I apply myself, is to not worry about the way things sound in the first draft. I write fantasy and I always look to use specific words for things like like in the current book that I'm writing, I want to use specific words for sir and miss and things like that, but I don't know what I'm going to use.
Okay.
So in the first round, I'm just putting miss and mister and sir in brackets because I know I'm going to change it later, but I don't know how right now. So just use whatever you can, use words
Yeah.
that you know are not going to end up in the
Mm-hmm.
final
Mm-hmm.
manuscript,
Mm-hmm.
and figure it out later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, makes sense. Just write your story, write everything, and then, like you said, the things that the little things, look at them later. What
Yeah.
about the new technology? I mean, you mentioned pro writing aid, but what about the
Hmm.
things or the rumors that are around regarding Chat GPT?
Hmm. I have to say I'm not familiar with the rumors surrounding fiction writing when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
ChatGPT. I have heard a
Mm-hmm.
lot about copywriters being afraid of losing jobs and things like that. I have worked with um, AI writers, and I find them very helpful in terms of research, but also getting a starting point. We were talking before the broadcast about the fact that I prefer editing over drafting, and
Mm-hmm.
using an AI like that would be a great way to get a first draft down
Mm-hmm.
without having to worry about
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is that's holding me back.
Yeah.
um, as long as you then put your own voice into it and edit it and go through all the rounds that you would usually go through
Yeah.
after a first draft anyway, I don't see any reason not to use it. The problem becomes when people use it and don't change anything, don't fact check anything, don't.
Mm. Okay, yeah, yeah, to just make use and think it's the easy way to get a
Exactly.
novel out there, yeah,
Yeah.
without any consideration of, you know. Again, here we are with the plot thing. One more question, because you said a fact check. I mean,
Hmm.
what about research then? Because the question often is, when you write fiction, you research
Hmm.
a lot and you want to put a teeny tiny bit of the things you found out into the book. But
Hmm.
there's also the question what to leave out and what to put
Hmm.
in. Do you
Right.
encounter that problem often with your authors? When you say, that might be a bit much. I know you know that because you've researched it, but
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I We refer to this as info dumping.
ah,
um, and info dumping can either be that or just sharing way too much information that is relevant to the story in one
mhm,
go.
mhm,
But it's also about oversharing. And a tip that I would give regarding that is to consider what's relevant to your character.
mm,
When you look at when you consider things like world building, I always go like, go through a day in the life of your character. What do they use? What do they encounter? Those are the things that are relevant for your readers to know as well.
mhm,
And if you go beyond that, then it might be interesting, but it's not relevant for the story. So
mm.
maybe share that on your other website instead of putting it in the book.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because leave, like you said, world building, leave a little bit to the imagination.
It's often there's this quote. I don't know who it's by and I don't know the exact quote, but it comes down to don't describe the vehicle, put your character in the vehicle with someone who knows how
Mm,
to use it.
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
that last part is crucial because if you put them in the vehicle with someone who knows how to use it, it becomes natural.
mm-hmm,
And that's
mm-hmm,
what you want from a foreign world.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. So, what about the use of adjectives in your
Ah,
writing?
nice one. um, I definitely am not in the camp of don't use any adjectives. What I will say though is that often adjectives can be replaced by a stronger alternative, or you can just remove them.
Mm-hmm,
Um, I think in the academy I use the example of the fox quickly ran to the den.
mm-hmm,
Um, just play around with it. Try out what it looks like without the adjective. The fox ran to the den. Is
mm-hmm,
that enough? If so, then there's no need to add the quickly. If you
mm-hmm,
want to get across that it goes very quickly, then maybe consider the fox sprinted to the den.
mm-hmm,
So considering stronger verbs versus verb plus adjective is
mm-hmm,
always a good way of figuring out whether there's a better alternative. But sometimes
mm-hmm,
the adjective is the way to go.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I see. Okay. Do we have any questions from our audience? Not yet at the moment. So, dear audience, please ask questions. Our guest is here to answer all of them. Also, do you have a favorite genre and a favorite author where you would say everything everything goes smoothly, everything is perfect?
There's no one author where I would say everything is perfect. I have to say that that is the downside of being an editor and having that editor brain always turned on. But I recently read the what's it called, the strange case of Jonathan's no, just Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, I think,
Mhm,
by Susanna Clark.
mhm,
I have to look that up to make sure. But I
mhm,
was very, very impressed with her descriptions, and that
mhm,
doesn't happen very often. They were very unusual descriptions,
mhm,
but very, very to the point. And
mhm,
sentences like, it was the color of heartache.
mhm,
It's like, that says so much,
mhm,
but uses so little words. And
mhm,
it makes you feel a lot when
mhm,
you read that. I was listening to the audiobook and the narrator was
mhm,
very very good as well, which helps.
mhm,
But it's oftentimes after I heard a description, I found myself smiling and thinking back to it, which doesn't happen a lot. And another author that I admire for his writing style is Jonathan L. Howard, who wrote Johannes Cabal, the Necromancer, and the other books that come with that. It sounds very, very dark. It's very, very funny. um, it's, I guess, fantasy, light horror, sci-fi, every little bit of everything.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'm not often impressed by writing style, but I was with his writing. It's very
Mm-hmm.
eloquent, but also easy to read.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Would you say then, like you just mentioned this author and her short sentence and the description, excuse me, less is more sometimes?
Often, yes. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like finding the right word is worth
Mm-hmm.
the time, but slight caveat, not as you're writing. Do that in the editing stage at the very
Okay.
end. When you know
Okay.
that everything else is fixed, then it's time to focus on finding the perfect word
Mm-hmm.
for um, descriptions and things like that. Don't
Mm-hmm.
break your head over that early in stages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Also, again, the descriptions. I mean, place, people, journey. I mean, I often think of the first book of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings.
Hmm.
I've read it in German. I have to admit that. I haven't read it in English. I've read it in German. Ah,
Hmm.
yes. Whew.
Yes.
Would you say it's the time when he wrote it, or s- insofar as we are no longer
it's a,
used to this kind of descriptions?
I think it's a combination of a lot of things. For me, I am a big Tolkien fan in his world building
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that he came up with all the languages and everything.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I'm just so impressed by that. But at
yeah.
the same time, when I read his work now, I I do find it off-putting a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
and I enjoy the craft that goes into it. But I think it's similar to, for me, listening to opera.
Mm-hmm.
I admire opera singers because I can see the technique that goes into it, and I'm blown away by what these people can do. But I
Mm-hmm.
don't enjoy listening to opera for the sake of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the same is true for some types of writing where you can admire the quality,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not your everyday read.
Mm-hmm.
And just like with opera, there will be people who do enjoy it
Yeah,
uh,
yeah,
for
yeah,
the fact, yeah, for just
uh,
for what it is.
yeah. I mean, the first it was just book one, which was a bit hard to get through. Book two and three, perfect. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what would you say about um, tempo in a book? I mean, again, we have script writers, and people who have experience with script writing, and I often feel they have a different pace than
Yes.
others.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think pace is one of the most difficult things for a writer to recognize in their own writing,
Mm,
um, because um, I mean, glaring issues you'll notice when
mm,
I was taking a look
mm,
at an old manuscript
mm,
that I wrote like 10 years ago. There were definitely things which I'm like, okay, this is way too quickly or way
mm,
too slow or whatever. But the less obvious things, I feel beta readers are a really good way to figure those out, because your readers are the ones who are going to enjoy it or not. And
mm,
if you get readers who are your ideal readers, um, they are a good sample of what the rest of your readership would be like.
mm,
Um, so I think that there's a difference in genre. thrillers are typically faster paced than um, costume dramas.
Mhm.
um,
It's the time,
and
probably.
yeah,
We're slowly at
yeah.
times, therefore we have a
No, but
slower
it's
pace.
and children's books are often fast paced in the sense that not fast paced in the sense that a lot happens on a page or
Mhm.
in the space of a few pages, but in the sense that there are not a lot of um, events that happen within one
Yeah,
story.
yeah.
So in that sense, the story is over
Mhm.
quickly.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
that's more timing than pace, maybe.
Mhm.
um, but yeah, it varies depending on the story, depending on the genre, depending on the type of reader.
Mhm.
And I do think that nowadays readers expect a faster pace than back in Tolkien's days. I saw an
Yeah.
interview with the son of the guy who worked at the publisher who got Tolkien the book deal for The Hobbit.
Mhm.
He was 7, 8 years old, I think, at the time,
Mhm.
and he read The Hobbit, and then his father asked him to write a review to
Mhm.
let him know
Mhm.
what he thought about it, and he he said that it was a book for children aged 5 to 10.
Huh.
5 to 10. I cannot imagine a 5-year-old nowadays reading The Hobbit.
Nope.
So
Nope.
there is also that.
Yeah. At times they are changing, and
Yeah.
they did change. I mean, they have changed, like you said, because our attention span
Yes.
is shorter. It also
Absolutely.
I think it's also true for us adults.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Dear listeners, we are waiting for your questions. That's your chance to ask everything you've always wanted to ask our guest. What is your, like you said, you're author yourself and you write yourself.
Mhm.
So you mainly write sci-fi, fantasy,
Fantasy, usually, yes.
fantasy.
I'm
Yeah.
currently working on fantasy steampunk, so that goes a little bit towards sci-fi.
Ooh.
It's my first time venturing in the steampunk world, so I'm very excited about that. And
Mm.
most of the time, my characters are animals, which often leads
Okay.
people to believe that I write middle grade, which is not the case.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So it's a lot of fun
Mm-hmm.
putting these animal characters into adult settings.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that also begs the question again, description, because I only have experience with steampunk in comic versions,
Yes,
stories, the pictures and so on. But I can't really say that I have read any any fantasy, steampunk fantasy.
I think that I'm still looking for more books to read in the genre before I start fully editing my own book.
Yeah.
But I have read Howl's Moving Castle by Diane. Is that Diane Wynne? Ah, I should know this name. Howl's Moving Castle.
Okay, don't worry. I mean, is there a lot of steampunk fantasy out there? I mean, like I said, comics they are quite popular, but
Yeah,
fantasy?
I feel like it is often sci-fi
Mm-hmm.
because it's about technological advancement
Yeah.
gone in a different way. But yeah, like I said, I'm still finding my way myself, um, and I'm looking forward to figuring
Mm-hmm.
out what the world has to offer. I do. I am familiar with a few series,
Mm-hmm.
are like Arcane and Shadow and Bone is a good
Mm-hmm.
example of
Mm.
um, steampunk-ish
Mm-hmm.
fantasy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah.
So you just said animal characters. I can highly recommend
Mhm.
crocs and cats.
Oh, I
Just
haven't
just a
heard of
shout.
that.
Yeah, yeah, no, just shout out to Stourbridge Junction Station again, in case a certain croc is listening to our to a conversation. Just what are the most popular characters, animal characters? I mean, cats rule the internet. We all know that, or at
Right.
least.
Yes. Oh, in that sense, yeah.
But
Yes,
otherwise,
absolutely.
what?
My main character is a fox, and some of the bad guys are hedgehogs and octopuses.
Hedgehogs are the
Yes.
bad guys. Hmm. Hmm. Interesting.
Hmm.
Very
A hedgehog
interesting.
with a top hat and a monocle. Just picture it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I can. I absolutely can. I mean, they are not as cute as you think, aren't they?
No, exactly.
Mm.
They sting.
Yeah. 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 Because we had a hedgehog family, I think, last year in our garden, and even we
Oh,
had a little one.
cute.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, okay. So basically the fox is the good guy and completely. So you turned it around because usually we would say
Mm.
the fox the cunning one and the one who's doing the bad things and the hedgehog the cute one and hmm.
Yeah, it's all over the place. The fox gets into a relationship with a rabbit.
Okay, I mean it's fantasy and steampunk. Okay, I
Yeah,
get
they're
it.
anthropomorphic animals. It's not.
Okay. Okay. Yep. Yep. I'm perfectly fine with that. I mean, yeah, yeah, okay. Sounds interesting. Sounds fascinating. So, regarding the editing question, have you forgot anything? Anything we said? Story plot,
Mhm,
characters, writing style. These are the
mhm.
let's
Yeah.
call them stages where you would
Mhm.
look at when you do the editing for an
Yeah.
author. Hmm.
Mhm.
That's also what a author should look at after writing the the first draft and doing the
Yes.
rewriting and the editing.
Yeah.
Hmm.
There are two other main things that I would highly recommend during the self-editing process, which is enlisting the help of beta readers, as well as taking breaks. And that sounds simple, but it's something that a lot of writers I see around me struggle with. Um, I after you finish your first draft, I recommend taking a month off, 4 weeks at least. And the reason for that is that you then forget what you've written, and it becomes much easier to look at your own writing from a healthy perspective. You're not focused on everything that's wrong or that's um, you won't just gloss over the things that are well written. It becomes much easier to recognize what's already working, and it becomes much easier to deal with the things that still need work. And so that's why I recommend the break between the first draft and the developmental edits, the big picture edits. And I also recommend another break between the big picture edits and the details, so developmental edits and line edits. And during that break, I recommend a round of beta reading. And after the line edits, I recommend another round of beta reading. And I feel like most people do one round, which is already great. Um, but two rounds can really help you get to another level because it helps you after you've done everything you can to get the big picture right. Um, there may still be things that you're unsure of, and there may still be things that you've overlooked. And if you then send your manuscript to beta readers, they can help you figure out anything that's not working yet in the big picture, either with story structure or plot, with characters, um, with timing and pace, what we just talked about. You need beta readers to help you uh, look into, like, see what does and doesn't work in terms of pace. Um, and world building is also something where, if like, world building is partly a big picture issue and partly a details issue, where the day-to-day world building is going to be down to details, because it's about the type of bread that your character eats, or the type of vehicle that they use to get from one place to another.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also about the major things of, does it make sense for this world to behave in this way?
Mm-hmm.
Or and I say world building, it sounds like I'm only referring to fantasy or sci-fi or things like that, but
Mm-hmm.
it also applies to stories that are set in our own world, where if you write a legal thriller, for example,
Mm-hmm.
you need
Mm-hmm.
to make the reader feel like they are in a legal setting.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're writing a costume drama, you want the reader to feel like they're back in that era where the story is taking place. So world building goes into that, not in the sense that you need to make up stuff, but in the sense that you need to focus
Mm-hmm.
on specific aspects of
Mm-hmm.
the surroundings, of the setting, of
Mm-hmm.
the way the characters behave. Um, and I was making a point before I got sidetracked. Um, so beta readers will help you nail that down and let you know if there's any big issues.
Mm-hmm.
So then, after you implement their feedback, you can rest assured that everything in the big picture is as good as it can be at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And then you move down to the details, and once you've made everything as pretty as you can, and enhanced your writing style as much as you can, and inserted your writing voice as much as you can, your beta readers will help you figure out if there are any areas where you could do so even better, and if there
Mm-hmm.
are any areas where things are not working the way you expect them to work. And so these 2 rounds of beta readers are going to help you really elevate
Mm-hmm.
the quality of your writing.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that is very important when you do those 2 rounds is to make sure that your beta readers who look at your story in the big picture round know that it is about the big picture, so that they don't start looking at language errors or things like
Mm-hmm.
that, because that's not
Mm-hmm.
relevant at that stage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. And where does one get beta readers?
That is one of the most asked questions that I get. And there are a few places where you can find beta readers. One is your own network. If you have people in your
Okay.
surroundings, writing
Mm-hmm.
friends, family,
Okay.
just make sure that if they are in your surroundings, that they are people that you trust to give their honest opinion. That you know that they're not going to just say that they like it because they like you. um, and
Which basically means don't give it to your mother.
Exactly. Well, it depends on your mother. I'm pretty sure mine
Yeah.
would
Okay.
not hesitate to. um, no, she's very sweet. But I yeah, that's the first place where you could look. But if I do recommend looking in different places. So you
Mm-hmm.
can look at the writing network that you've built online, for
Mm-hmm.
example.
Mm-hmm.
I also highly recommend looking at bookstagrammers in your preferred genre, in the genre that you write in, because readers look at books differently than writers do, and it can be
Mm-hmm.
very helpful to
Mm-hmm.
have other writers look at your writing, but they will probably look at it in a very technical
Mm-hmm.
way,
Mm-hmm.
um, because they know the type of feedback that you're looking for, and they know how to look beyond just reading. And if you have bookstagrammers, they will just treat it as any other book and
Okay.
let you know what they think. And
Yeah.
beta readers are about figuring out how your eventual readers are going to react to your book.
Yeah.
So, and I've heard a lot of writers feel scared, or well, maybe scared is not the right word. Feel intimidated by the prospect of asking someone they don't know to read
Mm.
their story.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that. I understand where it's
Mm-hmm.
coming from. But just put yourself in their shoes. If you have a genre that you love and
Mm-hmm.
an author approaches you and they're like, my book is not out yet, but I would love for you to read it before it's even out. How cool is that? I
Yeah.
mean, and as
Yeah.
long as you're clear about the expectations, they're allowed to say no. So you're not making them do anything that they wouldn't want to do,
Yeah.
um, and it's a win-win.
Mm-hmm. True. One last question, because
Mhm,
we have spoken about the things we do not put in the book because there is too much information.
mhm,
But what about things that you should put in? Because, for example, if you are in Austria
Hmm.
things are obvious for you. Yeah,
Right.
you know exactly what it is, what it means, and so on. But for someone in the Netherlands, maybe it isn't.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, it's a good one. I think beta readers help with that as well. If you make sure that not all of your beta readers are Austrian,
yep.
and you ask them to pay attention to that, like, are
Mm-hmm.
there any
Mm-hmm.
ways that you would feel the story becomes more ingrained in Austria?
Mm-hmm.
Or are there any passages where you're confused?
Mm-hmm.
As long as you're aiming for
Mm-hmm.
readership outside of Austria, because if you're aiming for Austrians to only read your book, then there's no issue. But
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, I think asking beta readers to look for that is a very good way of figuring
Mm-hmm.
out what you've overlooked yourself because
Mm-hmm.
you're too familiar with it.
Yeah, 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 exactly. Happened to me exactly. Because
It's all part of the process. There's nothing
yeah,
wrong
yeah,
with that.
because I absolutely knew what I was talking about. Didn't
Yeah.
even didn't even realize that someone else, because it's fact. What is it? I mean, come
Right.
on. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
It's a
yeah,
great
true.
question.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, dear listeners, everyone who's watching, your last chance to ask a question yourself before we ask our guest, my guest in this case, for the last words. She's ending the broadcast. No questions, no questions. At least one question. No, no questions. People have no questions. They are absolutely
So,
happy with what we've talked
anyone has
about.
questions after
Yep.
listening to this or reviewing it at a later time, feel free to contact me. I'm always happy
On
to.
yeah, exactly on your website. So I will leave the screen to you, also for a few last words before I say my goodbye then, or I will say what is there to say and thank our listeners. So over to you, and then I will end the broadcast afterwards. So over to you. What you would end this session with?
No pressure. Thank you, Edith, for having me on the Book Lovers Companion podcast. And thank you, listeners, for your interest in editing and your determination to finish your book and make it into something good, which is, I assume, why you're listening to this. A final piece of advice that I would like to give is to remember that you don't know what you don't know. So don't be afraid to look for guidance and support and to share what's going on in your mind because you'll be surprised at how many other writers are going through the exact same thing.
Famous last words. No. Uh, good advice. At least, uh, my guest and I will retreat to our green room and have a tea or a coffee or something stronger. And we would like everyone who was watching and also those who will watch or listen, because this episode will also be on our podcast platforms. You can listen to it or re listen to it and enjoy our conversation. And like our guest said, you have seen her website, selfeditingacademy.com, and you can always contact her and ask for advice. Or you also have workshops.
I have the Self Editing Academy that people can join. I offer a self editing roadmap that
Mm-hmm.
people can check out. And I also offer a free self editing checklist that you can download. And then you also get a newsletter with tips on self editing.
Perfect. Wonderful. Okay. So, Elsa, thank you so much for
Thank you.
joining me for this episode and for giving all this wonderful advice. What we have to look for, those who have already a manuscript on the computer and those who are working on the first draft or maybe the second or third draft. Thank you. So.